You're in the water loop.
Waterloop. Hey, this is Travis with Waterloop. You've probably heard me talk about how much I like High Sierra showerheads for their incredible water efficiency, their solid metal construction, and because it's a small business based in the U.S., with owner David Malcolm having a commitment to water and energy conservation. While I hope you value my opinion, there are some pretty major endorsements you should listen to. High Sierra showerheads were rated Best Showerhead by Popular Science and CNET, and Best Low Flow Showerhead by Wirecutter. If you go on Amazon, you'll see that High Sierra gets the highest ratings, 4.5 to 5 stars, from all the satisfied customers. You can use promo code WATERLOOP for 20% off at highsierrashowerheads.com.
Waterloop.
Welcome to Waterloop. This is Travis. Going to be talking about Colorado and journalism and water out west. I have Heather Sackett. She is managing editor at Aspen Journalism and the editor and reporter of its water desk. Heather, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Before we talk about Colorado and water out west, I want to talk a little bit about Aspen Journalism and just what it is and what the water desk is, because I think entities like it are very important these days. But yeah, just talk about that for a minute.
Sure. So Aspen Journalism is a local nonprofit investigative news organization, and we are funded entirely by individual donors and foundations. We don't get any money from advertising, and we are online, but we partner with local newspapers and local radio stations to distribute our stories. And so the way nonprofit works is once the stories are up on our website, aspenjournalism.org, anyone can republish them for free. And so our model is very collaborative, and we don't charge any of our partners for our content. It's all free. And so Aspen Journalism has two different desks, the environment desk and the water desk, which I run. And the water desk covers water issues in the Colorado River Basin and primarily in western Colorado. And to get even a little bit more specific, in the Roaring Fork River Basin, which is the watershed from Aspen, where the headwaters are, all the way down valley to the confluence of the Roaring Fork with the Colorado River in Glenwood Springs. And so that's primarily the area that I cover. And we also have freelancers in other river basins across western Colorado who cover stories for us. And then those stories are then published in their local newspapers. And I should mention that our primary publishing partner is Swift Communications, which owns a bunch of small newspapers in several western Colorado towns. And many of these are resort towns with tourism-based economies. So like Vail, Summit County, Steamboat Springs, Aspen, and Glenwood Springs. And then we also partner with the water desk at the University of Colorado Boulder, and they provide us some funding to do some of those freelance stories.
Yeah, fantastic. And so if there's a newspaper out there that wants to pick up one of these stories, you called them partners, but this is content they can just take and use without a fee and run it.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Unfortunately, we've seen what's happened to editorial departments, to newsrooms at mainstream publications over the past 5, 10, 15 years, right? Just the slashing of reporters. And I guess given that that's happened, could you talk about the role of these kind of nonprofit news entities like Aspen Journalism, why they're so important? Because you do see these popping up around the country and kind of rising to prominence a little bit more.
Sure. Right. Yeah. Like as you mentioned, by now, everybody's heard all of the bad news about local journalism, that papers are folding and sustaining major cuts by their hedge fund owners and laying off journalists, and how there's now news deserts all over the country. And I think a lot of these problems have been exacerbated by the pandemic, unfortunately. And so what we've been hearing over and over is that local journalism, and especially local print journalism, is a sinking ship. But I would like to offer that only commercial, profit-driven local journalism is a sinking ship. And over the last decade or so, as you mentioned, as legacy print media has continued to decline, the nonprofit news model has emerged as a way of restoring public interest, investigative, mission-driven journalism to its critical role in a democratic society. And there are now more than 200 nonprofit newsrooms across the US. Some examples that people might be familiar with are ProPublica. They often do collaborations with the New York Times, Chalkbeat, which covers education in several cities around the country, High Country News, which is a magazine about the West, and it's based here in Colorado. The Texas Tribune is also another big one people might have heard of, and the Salt Lake Tribune recently went nonprofit as well. So it's a growing trend. It's definitely sort of the bright spot in an otherwise bleak news ecosystem.
Yeah, and I've known a number of former reporters at legacy outlets, like you said, who have, lost their positions there and have transitioned over to these nonprofit entities and are just doing important but just quality reporting, right? They have the chops and the skills and are filling that critical void, like you said. It's interesting to see also that some of these outlets are taking on kind of broader regional/national issues, and then others are very hyper local focused. And there's clearly a need for, I think, both of those areas, and also on environment and water. Those environmental reporters were some of the first to go, and so this is all kind of filling that big void, like you said.
Right. Yes, definitely.
Yeah. All right. Well, glad to have you all out there for sure. And that's kind of how I stumbled upon you all, was some of the stories that caught my eye about water rights in Colorado and in the West and all that. For people that might not be familiar, could you kind of give a 101 level on how water rights work in Colorado and the West in general?
Sure. So first of all, just a caveat. I personally am only really familiar with water rights in Colorado. Okay. And so I know they're slightly different and vary by state. But so in Colorado, first of all, we have to get in our time machine and go back to about the 1880s when this area was first settled by white settlers, many of whom were miners and farmers and ranchers. And so back in the 1880s, when you wanted to plant some crops and irrigate them, because water doesn't just fall from the sky here, you have to actually take the water from the rivers and bring it through these surface diversions, through ditches, to your land, to water your plot of land and your crops. And so all you had to do was just to use the water, and then it's yours. And so in water terms, it's called putting it to beneficial use. And so if you're growing a crop with it, then it's getting put to beneficial use and you have the water. And so to make that water right official and to get it legal protections, you have to get it adjudicated by the state. So after start using the water, and then you go to water court, the water court approves it, and you get an adjudication date. And that date is very important because in Colorado, water rights are based, it's called first in time, first in right. So the older the water right, the more important it is, the more powerful it is. On some rivers, just a very few old and very big water rights basically control what happens on the entire river. Water rights are a right to use a public resource. Water is a public resource, but here it's really treated as a private property right that comes with a monetary value. So the oldest water rights are also the most valuable water rights. And in Colorado, the oldest and most valuable water rights generally belong to agriculture because they were the first people to put that water to beneficial use under that definition.
Wow. It's incredibly, as an East Coaster myself, it's incredibly complex stuff, especially when I was reading some of the stories, and you have different districts and different areas that manage certain kind of basins or certain rivers or certain withdrawals. And it's, could you talk about that just generally then, like the practical management or implementation, or how this stuff is provided, the monitoring too, like all that stuff. It's amazing.
Right. Yes, it is very complicated. So there's the Colorado Division of Water Resources. They are in charge of managing and monitoring all these water rights. It's called administration. So they like administer the river. Colorado's broken up into 7 river basins. And each of those basins is further broken up into districts. And I think there are like 78 water districts. Each district has their own water commissioner. Some districts have more than one water commissioner. And so that's the person who goes out and inspects all of the measuring devices and the diversions, head gates, infrastructure. So they're kind of like the boots on the ground people. They know all the water users. They go around to their properties and they help administer the river and settle disputes between water users. And most of these water commissioners have a ton of ground to cover. I just met with one in the Yampa River Basin, which is in northwest Colorado near Steamboat Springs, who was responsible for monitoring something like 400 structures. And
Wow.
so they're super busy. They might make it out to somebody's measuring device only once per season. And so in some cases, they're relying on the water rights holders themselves to keep diversion records of how much water they've been taking from the stream. And so they have these things called a partial flume that you stick in your ditch, and it's got like a little, like a ruler sort of on the side that can tell the water commissioner how many cubic feet per second they are diverting from the stream.
Wow, amazing stuff. There's obviously been a lot of drought in the West over the past bunch of years, and we've got all these climate change impacts continuing. And I just imagine, and I guess seen in the news how drought has just exacerbated all the debates over water rights and what's going down the Colorado River. And I was wondering if you could talk about kind of the impact of drought on water rights, and especially also I think the Colorado River Compact, just how that all has influenced things recently.
Sure. So drought and the Colorado River Compact are two sort of separate but related issues.
Okay.
But so first, I would just quibble with the semantics of that question. Sorry, can
That's
you
all
hear
right.
that?
Not a worry.
Okay, sorry, you can edit that, right? Okay, my editor's calling me, but we're going to ignore him. So first of all, I would say that a lot of the current tensions and problems and issues that we're seeing on the Colorado River are really fueled by climate change.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we're seeing since about the year 2000 is it's really less of a drought and more of a long-term aridification of the Colorado River Basin as temperatures continue to rise. So I suppose it is a drought, but it's a drought fueled by climate change.
So you're saying that it's more about long-term change in the climate of the area becoming more arid than it is just a temporary decrease in the amount of rainfall that's coming. This is actually a big pivot. That's
right.
Yeah.
And so there have been a lot of studies done by climate scientists at CSU in particular. And so what they found is there's not actually a ton of variability in the amount of precipitation. What the bigger problem is the hotter temperatures. And so what happens is as soils are drier and warmer, more of that water that would otherwise make it to the river ends up being sucked up by plants and by the soils. And so it just like the end result is that there's less water in the river because of these higher temperatures.
And now with climate change, those temperatures are kind of here to stay. It's not like this is going to reverse in the near future or anything like that.
Right. Yeah. And so one example of climate change impacting water rights in Colorado is on the Yampa River, which is in northwestern Colorado. And 2018 was a really dry, really hot year, and there was a call on the Yampa for the first time ever. And so just a little explanation of what a call is when a call happens when there's an older water rights user and they are not able to get their full amount from the stream. So it's hot, it's dry, and the flows just aren't there. And so they call up the Colorado Division of Water Resources and they say, hey, I'm entitled to get 10 CFS of water, but I'm only able to get 8 because the stream is really low. And so their water commissioner will go out, take a look around, and then they can place a call on the river. And that means that all the water users that have junior rights, so water rights with a date that is later, so essentially younger than theirs, they have to stop diverting so that this older, more senior water right can get their full amount. And this type of thing happens all the time in other Colorado River basins, but it was the first time ever that it happened on the Yampa. And so I think it was a real wake-up call for a lot of people that, like, hey, climate change is really starting to affect us as well.
Yeah, that's amazing. And then I imagine that there's some real tangible impacts to some of those junior water users that maybe can't properly irrigate crops or whatever their use is for water, huh?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And in Colorado, an interesting thing is that a lot of the junior water rights holders are actually municipalities. So it's the cities that are kind of like, we have this problem. Agriculture has all the water and the cities are growing and they need the water. And so what you're seeing is this, in a lot of cases, there's a transfer of water from rural agriculture to cities. And that happens through a couple different ways. But yeah, it is quite interesting how most of the junior water rights holders are, they date to like the early and mid 20th century, and they tend to be municipalities.
Very interesting. Obviously, they need to provide water to people for drinking and just household use. So they've got to be feeling the pressure and looking for ways to push conservation and other means there. Colorado River Compact, then, since I conflated the two, you want to take that one on separately and what that is and how that's impacted water rights?
Sure. So let's get in our time machine again, and this time go back to 1922. And that's when the Colorado River Compact was signed. It's basically a treaty between the upper basin states, which are Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, and New Mexico, and the lower basin states, which is California, Arizona, Nevada. And the part of the compact most relevant to this conversation is that it lays out this requirement for the upper basin to deliver a certain amount of water to the lower basin every year. And so this is like the ironclad law of the river, where this water, the upper basin has to send it downstream, and it's stored in Lake Powell, which is that giant reservoir on the border of Utah and Arizona, where it's a very popular place to go boating. And if you've been following Western water news at all in the last 2 decades, you're probably familiar with those ubiquitous photos of what they call the bathtub ring in Lake Powell, which shows how water levels have been dropping since about the year 2000 because of this climate change fueled drought. And so, there have been good years during that period with lots of snow, but overall the levels are dropping. And sorry, I lost my place.
No, I was gonna say, yeah, I've been to Lake Powell. I was there in 2003, I think, and you could see the white ring even then. So it's pretty amazing.
Right. And so this is bad because if water levels in Powell drop too low, it can trigger this cascade of negative impacts and effects. Perhaps the most important of which is that the upper basin it means they're not fulfilling its obligation to the lower basin to deliver the agreed upon water. And so that could trigger a compact call. So the lower basin could say, hey, you're not giving us our water. We're going to impose mandatory cutbacks for the upper basin. And, it's a little more complicated than that, but all the politics involved, but you hear water managers talk about this a lot. And people really want to avoid a compact call, because it could be this disastrous, interstate legal quagmire. And so everybody is trying to work to avoid that. And so the Colorado River Compact impacts these water rights by making these oldest water rights even more valuable. Like some of these agriculture rights date to the 1880s, but like I mentioned, most of the Front Range cities, where Colorado's most of the population lives, most of those rights are from the earliest 20th century. And so they are more vulnerable to these cutbacks in a compact call situation than Western slope agriculture would be. And so that makes the need for collaboration and cooperation between all these different entities so much more important.
Wow, amazing stuff. The other thing that I'm not sure how it relates here, but a demand management program. Isn't this part, am I getting this right, that this is a way to try to avoid some type of big situation where the upper basin's not fulfilling its part to the lower basin? Or maybe I'm now really muddling things, and let you take it over and explain how this is one approach to dealing with things.
Yes. Yeah. So a demand management program, Colorado is in the midst of investigating what that could potentially look like. They haven't made any decisions whether to move forward or not, but they're doing this feasibility investigation where we would essentially pay water users to reduce their consumption and instead leave that water in the river to send downstream to Lake Powell, where there's this 500 acre foot pool set aside basically as an insurance policy against a potential compact call. And so agriculture, Western slope agriculture is key to this program working, since that's where most of the water is. And so you would essentially be paying irrigators under a temporary voluntary program not to irrigate and to leave that water in the river. And so for the last year, 8 different work groups of water managers and water experts from around the state have been exploring this concept and whether it could work in Colorado. And they just released a 200-page report, which details all of their findings and a bunch of lingering questions that they have come up with after this first year. And that document is open for public comment. But no decision has been made whether this program is something that Colorado should do. And it looks like the work groups are going to continue to do this investigation for another year, although that decision is up to the state water board. But there's a lot of demand management is a bit controversial. There's some kind of mixed feelings about it. Some people are, especially in agriculture, people are skeptical that a program could be fair. And there was a whole work group dedicated to the subject of equity. So they're tackling questions like, how could a program make sure that certain basins or certain geographic areas wouldn't be negatively impacted by a demand management program? And then conversely, how could they make sure that a certain area wouldn't reap more of the rewards than another area, because remember, you are going to get paid for your water. So there's a real concern about equity of impact, but also equity of opportunity. But I think most people involved in this demand management discussion recognize the real threat posed by climate change and by the dwindling levels in Lake Powell and the threat of a compact call. And so they want to take some kind of action. And there is a sense of urgency to address this issue. But whether specifically a demand management program is the best course of action for Colorado is still something that they're still discussing.
You have so many competing diverse interests here, right? With government and agriculture, environmentalists, and what are the dynamics of that, of all those stakeholders kind of colliding as far as competition versus collaboration, and just kind of what's that dynamic like?
Right. Well, so like I mentioned, water is treated as a private property right. And so a lot of people in agriculture are very interested in maintaining that. A lot of water users in agriculture, their farm and their water that's their retirement fund. That's their, their whole life is poured into that. And so that group is very concerned with maintaining those private property rights and maintaining agriculture's control over their water. And then you have environmental interests and recreation interests, and they're sort of aligned in that they both want to see more water in the river. So groups, like boating groups and environmental advocacy groups, they all want to find ways to, increase irrigation efficiencies and try to get more water into the river. And then, but, I think I will say that there is a huge amount of collaboration in Colorado among the different water users and managers. And I think most people at this point, like I mentioned, recognize, the very real threat of climate change in a compact call. And they also recognize that you can get a lot more done by collaborating with each other and instead of fighting each other. So I think just recently there have been a lot of examples of good collaboration between all of these different competing interests.
Very interesting. The last area I wanted to ask you about with water rights is something that was sparked by one of your great articles about kind of private entities investing in water rights. Could you talk about that concept and the reality of it and what's happening out there?
Sure. So I worked on a recent series that focuses on water investment in the West. And that was, it's called Cash Flows, How Investors Are Banking on the West's Water Scarcity. And this was a collaboration with KUNC in Northern Colorado and Luke Runyon, who I think has been on your program before, and KJZZ in Arizona and the Nevada Independent. And so all three of these stories have a couple things in common. One is the transfer of water from agriculture to cities, like I kind of mentioned before. So it's this transfer of water from rural areas to urban areas. And another is how water is treated as a commodity and how some people think the value of water should be left up to the market to decide. And instead of water being treated as a public resource, a natural resource to be put to beneficial use, it's starting to be seen as a money-making venture. And so in Colorado's Grand Valley, which is just west of Grand Junction, it's kind of between Grand Junction and the Utah state line. There's a New York City-based hedge fund called Water Asset Management that has spent more than $16 million on 2,200 acres of irrigated farmland. And they're doing this presumably because there's money to be made on the water. And one possible path to making money could be through that demand management program, like I mentioned. And they could get paid to send their water to Lake Powell, the water that they're not using to grow crops. And so that's what's happening in Colorado. And then in central Arizona, you have these rapidly growing Phoenix exurbs, which are looking for new sources of water from the Colorado River. And so there's this town called Queen Creek, whose population has increased over 60% since 2010. And they are looking to transfer water from farmland to these new residential developments. And the interesting part there is that this farmland is owned by an investment company, which could stand to make $20 million from the deal. And so the rural farm communities that already use some of this Colorado River water think it's a slippery slope. And they think that if and when water leaves a community, it usually ends up being bad for the community. And then in northern Nevada, Water Asset Management, which is the same company that's buying land in Colorado, they own this farm called Winnemucca Farms that they want to sell a portion of the flood water. They want to capture 300,000 acre feet of floodwater and store it underground and wait for someone to be interested in it, presumably cities. So they want to wait for the cities to come calling, and that would result in water transfers out of the county. So once again, people are skeptical of this plan that could potentially transfer water away from rural agriculture communities to urban areas.
Wow, so much going on there. It's interesting. So if this entity owns this land, the water is supposed to be used for some kind of beneficial use, right? Like that's the irrigation of crops. But so would they be allowed to stop that use and sell the water downstream instead? Does that question make sense?
Yeah, well, so under Colorado water law right now, the answer is no.
Okay.
You have to, the value of water lies in its use. However, under a demand management program, that could change since it would allow for these temporary transfers. And then another thing, which, it's probably a little bit far-fetched, but some people are worried that if WAM is now the largest shareholder in the Grand Valley Water Users Association, and so some people think that if they were to gain a majority control, they could sort of tinker with the bylaws and figure out a way to sell this water. They could figure out a way around what the current rules are.
Sure. So what's the kind of the public perception of what's happening with these private entities kind of buying land and then having the water rights? What's the reaction?
So local residents seem to be pretty skeptical about what WAM is doing. The Grand Valley is this rural agricultural community with generational family farms. And so just the fact that this is a hedge fund from New York City, that fact alone sort of raises people's eyebrows. And when we were reporting this story, we actually had trouble finding someone to talk to us who had sold to WAM. We did talk to some people, but they just wouldn't go on the record. And they said, because it's such a controversial issue, and some people had said they became sort of social outcasts. One guy said everyone in town hates him now. And they can be seen as sort of selling out because they sold to this New York hedge fund. And I think there's so much skepticism about this issue because of this one cautionary tale you hear water managers talk about all the time in Colorado, and that's Crowley County. And so that's an area in eastern Colorado that used to be this thriving hub of agriculture until about the late 60s, early 70s, when they started selling their water rights to cities like Colorado Springs, Aurora, and Pueblo. And then when there was no longer farming in this community, the population started declining. Main Street became hollowed out with empty storefronts. And now Crowley County is known for its prison industry. And so that's essentially what's replaced agriculture, and that's now what provides jobs. And so Crowley County is sort of held up as this example of what can happen with when agriculture communities are separated from their water. And so I think that's something that people generally don't want to see happen again. And so they're very wary of what's happening in the Grand Valley. They're very leery.
Sure. It just makes me think of that, famous quote about whiskey's for drinking and water's for fighting, right? I mean, sounds like it. Well, Heather, I really appreciate your time and all this information. I feel like having talked to you and then talked to Luke before, I'm starting to learn a little bit more and have an understanding of water out west and all that. But thanks so much. I really appreciate it.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Waterloop, waterloop, waterloop.
The Waterloop podcast is brought to you by High Sierra Showerheads, the smart and stylish way to save water, energy, and money while enjoying a powerful shower. Use promo code WATERLOOP for 20% off at highsierrashowerheads.com.
You're in the Waterloop.
Waterloop, waterloop, waterloop.